So good morning. My name is Marlene Fong, and I'm one of the co-coordinators of this project, and my colleague Melissa Gilbert and I are known as M&M twins. So today, this morning, we are starting a journey into conversations about equity and access in our schools. And one of the purposes that we have for today is, if you've taken out this handout, the 321 Bridge activity, we would like for you to take some time to look at the statements. Some of you may be using this 321 activity as part of a formative assessment for your student learning, and it may look slightly different than this, like three things that you learned from the content that you're teaching, 2 things that you're going to add to your repertoire, and 1 more question that you have about it. So I've adapted this activity to help us go deeper into our conversation about equity today. So if you just take a few minutes to fill it out. Some of you already started filling it out. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the why. I'm usually the member of the team that says, if someone says, we want to do this, this, and this, and I always ask, what is the why? Why are we talking about this? And when we talk about the why for equity and access, it has a lot to do with the whole social justice framework. The access and equity that is embedded in the new state standards, the equal opportunity for all students to excel and succeed. And to me, that is a big why in terms of what this project is all about. And then I also need to add the additional component of the social emotional aspect of our students. And that is another big why as to what you're doing in terms of teacher and educator-led professional development. And when we look at what is happening in our state, the California state population is growing exponentially, and you can see the numbers there that even by the fall of next year, there's going to be an additional 2.5 million people. When you look at the student population of this state, there's over 6 million students. We are the largest state in the nation and the 2nd largest in terms of student population. And when you look at the student population, the largest growing ethnic minority group is the Hispanic population in this state. And then when you look at the rest of the distribution of the population, the white or Anglo population is at 23.2%, and then the rest of the ethnic groups follow behind. So FYI, in terms of what studies have come out of the census about 10 years ago, the population that is growing in the state of California is not by natural birth. It is by immigrant populations that are moving into the state of California, and those populations bring children, and they are the ones that are having children in our state. So the next statistics that I'm going to share with you is the diversity of our teaching workforce. So when we look at our teaching workforce, the reverse is true. The state population shows that the white population is the majority of the teachers in our schools. Although in California, the percentage is a little bit lower, but nationally it's about 80%. And about 80% of our teaching workforce are white females. So again, you see an inverse, and what we need to be sensitive about in our state is the fact that there is a teacher shortage and there is a need to recruit and add teachers from diverse backgrounds. And as that is happening, if the formula gets reversed at some point, we still need to deal with a need and an issue of all of us being able to work with students who look different than us. So part of what we're going to be experiencing for the rest of the day today is a presentation on changing our discourse about education, about ethnicity, and based on what you're hearing today, there may be a need to have some conversations. Some of us may have different feelings that come up for us. So we will have what is called affinity groups after the presentation this morning, and giving an opportunity for you to have that conversation safely within your ethnic group. And we have another presentation after lunch on bigotry and bias in the classroom and dealing with it. And then we're looking into ourselves at the end of the day. What am I, as an individual, would I be willing to commit to? And what would my team, my ILC team, and I would be willing to commit to in adding to your sustainability framework? So with that as a framework for what we're going to be experiencing the rest of the day, I would like to introduce our presenter and speaker for this morning. His name is Greg Peters, and he has been an educator most of his life, a math teacher, administrator, and he is now the executive director of the San Francisco Coalition for Essential Schools, and the focus of their work is about equity. So I'm going to let Greg come up and introduce himself and the rest of his background, and then we'll get started this morning. So thank you for your attention.
Good morning, everyone. So today, well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be here to open for you and to hopefully provoke everybody in the room in a way that asks you to look in the mirror and somewhat think differently about the work that you do individually and we do together. So the focus of today's presentation is on radical discourse, and the need for us to name what needs to be named. And guiding this presentation is the essential question: what do we need to know about our systemic? Wow. I'm going to use these mics. Thank you. What do we need to know about the systemic dominant culture and those it best and least serves in order to interrupt implicit bias and microaggressions in our educational settings? Before we get started, I think it's really important that we calibrate some of our language. I think equity is a very popular word, is a very popular term in education right now, and yet in the different settings that I work, I frequently will ask the question, what's your definition of equity? And it's infrequent that people share a common definition, even within their own context. So our organization took some time to create our working definition of educational equity. And it's important to recognize that when we talk about equity, we are not talking about equality, that they're actually, they're not the same. And we define educational equity in the sense that it's about equal input regardless of this is educational equality. It's about equal input regardless of outcome. It assumes every student begins at an equal starting place and continues with constant and equal access to information, resources, and support. While educational equity is about equal output or results based on authentic data related to student achievement and experience, regardless of, rather than dependent on, a student's internal, social, or cultural contexts. So why equity? So this week, every time I'm asked to do a presentation, the day before, the night before, I'll do a quick search, and I'll just put in the terms racial equity schools, see what pops up. This is what popped up last night. This past week, 72 officers were put on administrative duty for posting racially offensive messages on social media, including messages calling for the extermination of entire peoples. I just want to be clear, this didn't shock me when I saw it because this has happened before. This happened within the past couple of years in San Francisco. This has happened in Denison, Texas. And a nonprofit, Injustice Watch, found that of these 328 officers, so only 72 were put on administrative duty, but of the 328 officers who had posted troubling content, 1/3 of them had one or more federal civil rights suits filed against them. So when we question whether or not we're in a post-racial context, when we question whether or not, when talking about equity, we should be elevating racial equity as a specific piece of our work, for me, there's no question. When we're talking about educational equity, we're talking about a lot of demographics. We want to look at students' language, immigration status. We want to look at sexuality, gender, class, language, etc. But in our country, race continues to be the demographic variable we wish to speak least about. And so for that reason, it is the first variable we speak of when talking about equity, and we trust that the lessons embedded are transferable. So that's why today you'll hear a lot about race, and that's why when we break into affinity groups, we will be breaking into race-alike affinity groups. So let's, again, in this idea of calibrating our baseline understandings of some concepts, let's talk a little bit about bias, because bias is another term that seems to be very prevalent in the work that we're doing in education. When we think about bias, the idea of the iceberg is a really great metaphor for me because, again, we'll see the iceberg, we'll see the top of it, that's what we're focused on, and there's a whole bunch of ice that we're not looking at that's actually the real danger in the iceberg. So when we're talking about bias, we frequently spend our time in our schools, our districts, our communities, talking about our behaviors. And one of the manifestations of bias is microaggressions. We'll frequently talk about specific language that we're using and what language is inappropriate or appropriate to be using. And that's where we're talking about dominant discourse. And if we get caught in that and we don't get to the intent of that language, well, we'll constantly be picking on this word versus that word versus intent. And when we're talking about addressing bias in our schools and our districts, we've spent a ton of time, a ton of money, a ton of human capital on programs, intervention services, and curriculum. And I want to be really clear. These are good programs. These are really good solutions. I believe and trust that we have the education, we have the technology, we have the knowledge to educate all of our students equitably. We have so much that we know about trauma-informed schools, PBIS, restorative practices, etc. Culturally relevant pedagogies. These are all effective strategies, and yet we continue to find ourselves in these cycles of revisiting them and needing to rename them and reclaim them. And that's because we're not getting to the bottom of the iceberg. And when we think about what's at the root of all of where we're putting all of our energy, we're not taking enough time to really think about the thoughts, feelings, needs, beliefs that are underneath them, both systemically and individually. This is the conscious as well as unconscious bias. We're not talking about and thinking about in a real radical fashion the systemic dominant culture that's actually behind the design of our public education. When we take the time to monitor people's language and figure out what's the right word in this case and the wrong word in that case, again, that's all important. We want to be able to be respectful in our language, but when we're spending all of our time there, we're actually feeding into the system of reproduction because we're keeping busy rather than looking at the root issues. And so we're not taking enough time to really unpack the history, the unchecked norms, values, priorities, not only of our schools and our districts, but of our educational system as a whole. And this is work that we need to do simultaneously. We're going to call this work transformational work. So we have amazing programs, we have amazing ways of educating our young people, and unless we're doing the transformational work, we will need to keep revisiting those programs and those practices. When we think about implicit bias, I just wanted to unpack that language a little bit, because the definition is the attitudes and stereotypes that unconsciously affect people's perceptions, actions, and decisions. And it's important, again, to put some language and definition out there, because this word implicit bias, when we just reduce it to those two words, sometimes makes us think that it's invisible. And so my question really is, invisible to whom? Because when we look at the impact of implicit bias, it is very measurable. There's a disproportionality in discipline, and we are working hard to have policies that seem to be racially neutral. And yet, when we look at the impact of these policies, they're perpetuating the overrepresentation of students of color, and in our schools, particularly our black boys. And that's because we are still leaving a lot to be determined when we have, again, what appear to be racially neutral terms like defiance, disrespect, interrupting the educational process, zero tolerance. There's disproportionality in our special education, or the education of our students with disabilities. And we are frequently using programs meant for students who have learning differences as ways of pushing out students that we don't know how to educate. We need to re-examine and stop underestimating the intellectual capacity of students from different cultures, linguistic backgrounds, and recognize that when we are embracing our diverse communities, we should be starting with looking for the strengths, the assets that are not only measured by dominant culture standards, but are actually unique to dominant culture standards. Our policies are continuing to track students, even in schools where we say we don't track. And we're continuing to think about ways of solving our problems using the same rhetoric, the same strategies, the same drop-down menu that has led us to our current situation. So again, the question is, implicit bias, implicit to whom? So our students, they see the news. They're feeling dehumanized. They see who's in the halls disproportionately. They feel invalidated. They see, they learn, we are the bad kids. Our bias has been fed by and continues to feed a cycle that reinforces this system. But it's also important to know that that education, where we're perpetuating internalized oppression for many of our students who are othered, we are also educating those who do the othering. So all the students are watching. Regardless of the demographics of our schools, we all have a responsibility to interrupt this pattern. As I mentioned, one of the manifestations of implicit bias is racial microaggressions. And again, similarly, the question would be micro for whom? The definition of racial microaggressions is commonplace verbal or behavioral indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, and that's really key here, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults. And I know there's people in the room saying, hey, microaggressions can be other than racial, and that's true. And we're focusing on racial just for these 90 minutes. We can do that. And the seminal piece of work that was done around racial microaggressions identifies 3 specific types of microaggressions or categories. The first one is the micro insult, which frequently is unconscious. And here's the thing, so many people who perpetuate harm have really good intentions. So many people don't want to be perpetuating harm. That is absolutely true. And so it's important to know that it's unconscious so that we can get that past that and be like, that's not what I meant. Great, now let's get to the place of impact. And so this is where a move or some language communicates something that demeans, is rude, or insensitive to a person's racial identity. An example of this might be to make assumptions about a person's likes or dislikes, struggles or strengths, simply based on their identity. When we make the assumption that our Asian students must be getting A's in our math class and don't need support, that's a racial microaggression. When we try to connect with that new black student in our class by talking about the hip hop we like, that's a racial microaggression. Microassaults frequently are conscious, and these are intended to hurt or discriminate through explicit, violent racial attacks. And I really appreciate that the authors use the language violent. And it allows us to unpack it, because when we think of violence, we probably have a very specific image in mind. And yet the examples might not be those images we have in mind. And so one of my favorite examples is that as a child of color, every single one of their teachers might be white. And someone might say, how is that violent? And again, this isn't about the intent, this is about the impact. And for somebody to go through every day of a school year being judged, because that's what we do as educators, is we're judging, we're evaluating, we're assessing, right? And to do it in a way that unconsciously, through other ways, might be dehumanizing, how is it not violent to feel a sense of dehumanization every day? And the last one that they speak of is microinvalidations, where we exclude or negate experiences, thoughts, or feelings of people of color, where we question the validity of the experiences by asking, do you really think it's about race, or you're just being sensitive, or that person didn't mean that? And the irony, the sort of cycle of microaggressions, is that one of the challenges of microaggressions is that those who are being microaggressed are frequently, because the micro is about the subtlety, they're frequently questioned that, did that really happen? Can I actually say this out loud? Is it going to seem like I'm that kind of person? Which in and of itself is a microinvalidation. So again, just to sort of pull it out there, because we're trying to create conditions where all of our students can feel a sense of value, a place where their humanity is respected and honored, which means we will need to interrupt and turn around some of the conditions that are in our schools, and they're in our schools simply because our schools are part of our society right now. And so it's, as a reminder, perpetuators are often unaware that their communications are actually coming off as microaggressions. These actually do cut across social identities. Intent does not always equal impact. And for folks who want to learn more about it, I really encourage you to go out and learn more about this. We will have a resource available to you all through the organizers, but my favorite metaphor of this is that it's a death. We're talking about death by 1,000 paper cuts. And the reason that's powerful for me is, as someone who comes from dominant culture, it could be easy for me to think of a microaggression as not a big deal. And so when I think about a paper cut, I hate paper cuts. I hate them. They smart. And literally what goes on in my head when I get one is I can't wait till tomorrow when it just feels a little better. So death by 1,000 paper cuts is suggesting, what happens if I get that and I don't get to have that narrative, because right afterwards I get another one, and right afterwards another one. And every day I'm getting 10, 20, 1,000 paper cuts. And the piece here is, every paper that's giving that paper cut is a different piece of paper. And so that paper is sitting alone going, I only gave you one paper cut, what's the big deal? So we are challenged to move to transformation. We are challenged to transform the very way we exist and our schools exist for the benefit of our young people. And it's not new information to say that transformation is inside-out work. And at its simplest, we're not going to be transformative for others in a systemic way unless we are ourselves going through our own cycles of transformation. And so the work does start individually. And only when we are going through our own cycles of transformation will we see our very practice change, because our schemas will change. And only when our practice changes and we see the results of our practice changing will we be in a position to actually transfer that transformation by supporting our colleagues, our peers, our students, to transcend the results that are intended from our current system. Another way of saying this comes from the words of Carl Jung, who says, if there is anything that we wish to change in the child, we should first examine it and see whether it is not something that could better be changed in ourselves. If every single time, if we get to a place where every single time a student under our watch is not successful, if every single time we start with, what do I need to do differently, we will make an impact. So the good news is, all we gotta do is transform. There is other good news. Transformation happens. It's called evolution. And it takes a really long time. So I had the great fortune of being able to study this idea of transformation by studying teachers who were identified by students, principals, and data through triangulation as being transformed in the sense that they both worked in the system and fought against the system at the same time, and in the sense that they got results that the environment around them did not get. And from that work, we offer a framework for transformation. And this is about the conditions that we need to either establish for ourselves individually, or more importantly for our schools, so we're in constant cycles of transformation. And I would like to unpack some of that and actually give us time to do a little bit of reflecting together. So what we learned is that there's actually 4 stages or 4 sets of conditions that are necessary to allow us to be in these cycles of transformation. So all these good programs we're investing in will have sustainability, longevity, will become internalized. And I'll go through these quickly before we spend a little bit more time in each one individually, but the first one is stance and schema awareness. We need to do identity work, not only our own identity work, but the identity work of our system and of our communities. We need to know what we're transforming from to better and more effectively transform to who we wish to be. We need to create conditions to interrupt inequities in the moment. This is the hardest of the stages in our current system, because our current system is designed for us to avoid such conflict. And it's designed that way because as educators, we are disproportionately and therefore unfairly given the weight of responsibility of all the ills in society without the autonomy and without the resources to actually take responsibility for that. So we've created a persona that says we're not going to go into that space of radical discourse or of interruption. And even when we do create the conditions to interrupt inequities, chances are we're good people doing the best we can. So the interruption itself will not lead to the transformation. It'll lead to awareness, and we'll be like, thank you for pointing that out. I'm going to go do my best tomorrow, but I was doing my best yesterday when this happened. So we need to create spaces, and there's multiple spaces that are necessary for us to actually make new meaning of our inequities, and only then can we move to radical change and bold actions. It's not linear, it's cyclical. And what we've learned in the years where we've been supporting our schools and our districts to engage in this work is that there's some baseline infrastructure that needs to be in place for cycles of inquiry and cycles of transformation to take effect. One is we need courageous leadership. If we don't have leaders that are modeling with humility their own transformation cycles, then we are not sustaining or supporting or fostering the conditions for others to take those risks. We need shared purpose. There's a ton of social justice leaders in this state. Ton. There's amazing social justice leaders in all of our schools. And many of us come with our own agendas. When we walk in the building, are we clear what the shared agenda is? We need calibrated language, and hopefully you heard a little bit of the reason for that at the beginning. And as I mentioned also earlier, we need effective practices. Just doing the personal transformation work is not enough. That is the investment, so what we know to be true as positive and powerful practices will actually take root. So let's start with stance and schema awareness. Dr. Asa Hilliard says, "We have maintained historical commitment to the same paradigm that we had when public education began in the United States, ascribing genius to a select few. Regardless of our intent, if we look at the construct of public education and if we look at the outcomes of public education, the uninterrupted outcomes of public education, this is still true." So when we talk about how we show up in the skin we're in and creating space so that we as communities and we as individuals can do that work, this is again constant and continuous, and we need to develop awareness of ourselves, our systems, and others where we are right now. This isn't the aspirational of who we want to be. We need to take time and ask, who are we in the skin we're in right now? And that's hard. Because if we're talking about getting better, but we have to start by talking about who we are, we have to create conditions for it to be very safe to say some truths that might not be that place where we're going yet. We need to recognize, therefore, that when we see cultural barriers, cultural differences, we're not equating those with barriers. We're seeing cultural differences and re-examining how we define strengths and success. And we do this by studying and reflecting on our operant theory. We need to, again, look at our identity. We need to look at our history, cumulative as well as formative experiences. And we need to constantly interrogate our current reality. We need to be looking at data, quantitative and qualitative data, regularly and publicly. This is not, it comes in the email, we do a quick glance at it, we think we've got the solution and we're on our action plan. We need our communities to be sitting in our data, discussing our data, making meaning of our data on a regular basis. And we need to constantly re-examine and interrogate our very design, our very decisions in our schools, and keep and continuously ask, who are these decisions and designs most benefiting, and who are they least benefiting? If we needed to do this work in August and be done with it, we would have to create some masterful curriculum. But the good news is, this is constant and continuous work. And so really what we need to be thinking about is, how are we creating this thread of reflection about who we are? So what I'd like to do is just share a small example of how we might do something like this. This is a brilliant artist's rendition of a gingerbread person. And I'm just gonna put a few prompts out here. If the skin we are in represents the characteristics, the experiences that influence who and how I show up every day, how might I describe the skin I'm in? It's also important for me to ask, how might others, in particular those across difference, and in particular my students across difference, describe the skin I'm in? Because frequently we think the world sees us the way we see us, and then we're not prepared for some of our relationships or interactions. And as a result, how do I consciously or unconsciously show up? And how does that influence my actions in my work and my leadership? So as an example, if we were to do this as a little bit of a warm-up or an exercise around identity, here's what I might put. First thing I did is I'd say, I'm male. And I have to put that down because of all of my privilege, my gender identity is the one I still have to work hardest on to be conscious of. I grew up with 3 brothers, my dad, my mom had all brothers, my dad had, there just was a lot of testosterone in my family, a lot. And there's something that's just like internalized, that there was a norm to how we communicated, how we joked, how we fought. And it's still invisible to me unless I'm working hard to make it visible. I also grew up working poor. And it's interesting because I went to college, because I have white skin, I've been able to experience what it looks like when people don't think I grew up working poor, and I get to hear them talk about my family without knowing I'm in the room. But that also, working poor piece, also shows up in a different way for me. It shows up in my work ethic, which is the opposite of what people think. It's incredible, to a fault. It also talks about my relationship with food. I was a strict principal. I was a very strict principal. And until I until I reached a certain level of my own identity work, which my students really helped me with in this case, they knew something about me that I didn't know. Kids shouldn't go hungry. My office was right in the middle of the building. If a student was sent out of class, they had to walk by my office. If I saw a student walk by my office, I would call them in. What's going on? And frequently, we'd have really good conversations, but for the kids who just did not want to have the conversation, somewhere, the rhetoric, the narrative, it got out. All they had to do was to say, oh, Peters, I'm sorry, I'm just really hungry. And then everything changed. I'd be like, oh, wait, I've got a cup of noodles here. Can I make you some eggs? What can I do? You gotta eat. Until gratefully, a student ally, a 10th grader, said, Peters, you know what they're doing to you, right? So I needed to know, because this showed up with me. It didn't mean I didn't feed them from there on, but I fed them as we talked. I'm Lebanese and Italian. You notice I put that near my stomach. That's not by mistake. I identify both as politically and sexually queer. And this is really important because also growing up closeted, even though my husband says you could never be closeted, that's his own internalized homophobia. I'm going to name it. We're all doing our work. Again, I got to be in the room while people talked about me, and this time my own family, without knowing I was in the room. This is formative. It identifies how I show up. This one I always crack when I say, I'm the student who is bullied every day of his freaking student career. Every day. I know who every one of those bullies are, by name, by face, and that was decades ago across the country. If you don't think that does not show up with me every day I walk into a school, then you're being foolish. But it also shows up with me every day with my relationship to this idea of harm. Most importantly, how I cause harm. I'm married. I've been married 4 times. People are surprised to hear that. But again, same person. That's the politically queer piece. And I grew up where family came first, over everything. So my relationship with loyalty is to a fault. I'm a newer dad. Thank you. This is really formative because 2 years ago we took in a foster child. He is 8 years old right now, and he is living out all of the reasons we do this work. And it's shifted completely how I show up quickly. This isn't my long-term history. This is formative. I have found myself always to be in positional power. When I worked at McDonald's, I was a shift manager. When I worked at a camp, they asked me to lead the camp within 2 months. And I don't know why. Personality, drive, there's something about that. I don't like being the boss, by the way. And yet, I'm constantly in positions of power, and that is important for me to remember because of how I'm perceived, regardless of what I think of it. I have my doctorate. Forgive me for the academics. Well, you're not going to like this because forgive me for the academics in the room, but it doesn't mean a lot to me. I'm glad I did it. We did great work, but my education comes from my parents. And nothing has come close to that. And the last thing that I put down is that I'm white. And I put that because no matter what other intersectionality I have in my life, when I show up in a room, the first thing people see is that I'm a white man. And I have a responsibility to always remember that and to always be thinking about that. So right now, I'm going to ask you to do a turn and talk. And before you actually turn and talk, I'm going to be clear. I'm asking people to step out on skinny branches here. I want you to be really thoughtful about who you need to turn and talk to, including if you choose to do individual reflection instead of turning and talking, so that you can do the hardest work that you'll allow yourself to do. If, for whatever reason, you find yourself in conversation with someone that you don't trust, or you're not sure if you trust, or you don't have a relationship, you have agency of how far you go or don't go in that work. But just take a few minutes right now to do a turn and talk, and if you had a gingerbread person in front of you right now, what would be the first things that would be on there? If you thought for a moment or two, what would you be surprised that you realize, oh wait, this should be on there as well? And what do you think that others might put on there even if you wouldn't, based on how you're perceived? Right? So just have a 2 to 3 minute conversation with each other about your gingerbread person. So when we think about the second set of conditions, the second stage of work, creating conditions for interruptive and catalytic experiences where we can disrupt the mental models that we walk in with. Chief Joseph says, "Good words will not give my people good health and stop them from dying. Good words will not get my people a home where they can live in peace and take care of themselves. I am tired of talk that comes to nothing. It makes my heart sick when I remember all the good words and broken promises." When we think about the radical discourse that is needed, we need to create the conditions that allows us to move from good words and empty promises to the conversations that we need to have. Some conditions we've recognized are necessary to do this work is that we need to have personal and organizational commitment. We must develop shared buy-in. We do this through community norms and agreements, calibrated expectations of the necessary work, and we should have equity-centered structures and strategies that ritualize as scaffolds the type of discourse we're trying to have. And the reason I say ritualize as scaffolds, well, let me just check in the room. Show of hands, how many people have been in professional development where you have used protocols? Wonderful. These are pretty common. The challenge is, when I first learned about protocols, this became the definition of how we were supposed to talk. And so it was a ceiling. It limited our discourse. And when things got uncomfortable, we could say, oh, that's not in the guidelines. And the truth of the matter is, these rituals should be helping us through structure see and feel different ways of engaging equitably, so that when we take the scaffold away, we are a community that has some practice and knowledge of what it looks like to engage more equitably in our discourse and in our work together, our collaboration. And you do this with continuous trust building and community building. Like I said, protocols. You want to create opportunities where we're hearing and sharing our stories so that we can identify not only our common struggles, but elevate and celebrate our differences. And again, it's in this time that we're continuing to calibrate our language to make sure that this discourse, when we are having it, we mean the same things. So we talk about norms as an example. And yet when I go into schools, there's two things I'll frequently see in the norms. One, they're filed somewhere. And when you ask someone, what are the norms? They say, well, you know what? I'm not really sure. And two, they're usually created for the comfort of adults rather than the dissonance of change. When they're filed somewhere, people think they have no norms, and the truth of the matter is, whether they're written down or not, every community has norms. When they're filed somewhere, it just means you're using a different set of norms, probably reinforcing dominant culture of some sort. And if you're really curious what your norms are, ask somebody new to your community what they learned in the first week of how things got done. When we want to have norms that are pushing us to be in a different way with each other, it's important to recognize who we're creating the norms for what benefit. So a lot of times we'll see the norms be on time, end on time. So I don't know any other profession where you have to negotiate whether or not you show up on time. I also know that the disproportionality of students being pushed out of class is related to, in part, tardiness and absenteeism. So this norm that we want for ourselves, one, is not anything more than a job expectation that we don't want to hold ourselves to, but we do want to hold our students to. What would it look like instead to have the norm of stay engaged, meaning when it gets rough, when it gets uncomfortable, we're going to do the work to stay in it with each other. There was a community that struggled with whether or not they were going to agree on having the norm be respectful. I'll say it again, I don't know many communities where that should be an option. So my question to the community was, if we don't agree on it, do we get to be disrespectful? Versus experience discomfort. So much of our current way of being is to keep us as adults comfortable at the expense of progress for our students. What if we were to say, listen, when we go home, we want to be comfortable. Find that pillow, find that place, find that beverage, whatever. But when we show up and we're taking our students' monies, we should be in the discomfort of dissonance and change and improvement. Step up, step back. That's a norm for equality. That's assuming we all have the same thing to say for every single topic. That means that the disproportionality of 80% white teachers does not count in who we hear from on different topics. And what we really need to be doing is holding lenses of inquiry about patterns of participation. And it's a practice we should be doing in our classes anyway. Who's talking, when, why? And that inquiry is suggesting there's not necessarily a right and a wrong. There's not a script here. But if we maintain inquiry, we can look at those patterns and ask, who is this serving, who's it not? As a white man, I was taught a few things about patterns of participation. I always lose points when I give the secrets out. One, speak first and you get to direct the conversation. Two, speak last, you get to reclaim it regardless of what was said. Three, the last two rules count for everything that's up here in the head. And when we're doing scary work, shut up and you don't have to be accountable, but you get to say, I participated because I talked when I talked first and I talked when I talked last. There's not really a white book, but I really was taught that through modeling. And finally, we hear about assuming best intentions, and I think there's enough evidence out there that we should not. But it's okay if we can create a space where people get to speak their truth, so we start there. The challenge of speaking your truth is that you have to be willing to hear each other's. So as we create conditions to interrupt inequities, we want to ask, who and how do we want to be in our work? How do we want to stretch, and can we make those our norms? How do we practice our norms so that we can hold each other accountable, but we can also start practicing making mistakes? Because if these are really stretching areas, we shouldn't be perfect at it. And we shouldn't shy away from it because we might fail. And what are the scaffolds we need? Again, so that when we remove them, we can be in these norms, have the radical discourse without the tools, without the protocols. So again, an article that'll be made available to you is a seminal piece on the discourse that we need in our schools. And the authors of this article, Changing the Discourse in Schools, identifies two types of discourse. And the current discourse in schools is identified as Discourse 1. And this is the language that is typically used to talk about, question, plan the work of schools, change or reform, and it supports and maintains the status quo, but without appearing unresponsive. This is not the hate talk. This is not the insulting or harming conversations that we sometimes have in schools. This is the talk you hear when people are in meetings trying to solve problems and trying to do good, but not getting to the root issues. The school that came up with Saturday school, and I'm not saying Saturday school as a rule is Discourse 1, but there was a school that came up with Saturday school, and I will say that in this one case it was a Discourse 1 solution, because what happened was that they had some students who were constantly late to school and they were missing instructional minutes. Instructional minutes are so important. We need them to make up their instructional minutes. We've tried everything. So if they continue to be late, we're going to give them Saturday school. And look, they make up the instructional minutes. Sounds caring. And it wasn't until after Saturday school was failing that they decided to delve deeper and realize their students were missing school because, yep, they had other responsibilities at home. But that wasn't the root issue. The root issue was that their other responsibilities at home were in competition for their instructional minutes at the beginning of the day, and the reason home won was because what was happening at the beginning of the classes did not compete. And what they needed to rethink was how they were bringing their children in and educating them from that first instructional minute. Discourse 2 is the language that tends to be about the uncomfortable, unequal, ineffective, prejudicial conditions and relationships in schools, and opens up space for ambiguity and change to be part of a purposeful structure. And I always hear people say, when does Discourse 2 get to be about the happy stuff? And I say, you can talk about happy stuff, but can we go back to the definition? Tell me when it should be happy stuff that we're talking about the uncomfortable, unequal, ineffective, prejudicial conditions. So even when we introduce this definition, people want to resist it. In your packets, you're going to see a T-chart that looks something like this. Go ahead and take that out. It's green. Thank you. And there's two sides. One has blanks. It's on the right-hand side. The good news is you don't have to get up from your seats. It's right there. So turn to the side with the words. I'm not going to ask us to read all of them. I want us to just go through a few examples so you can start to get sort of a sense of it. So Discourse 1, again, so you can understand that this is the stuff that sounds reasonable. It deals with the work of adults and sounds like we cannot expect every teacher to know every student's culture. I've heard it. I've said it. It's reasonable. It's not going to lead to the change that we need. While Discourse 2 deals with the learning and experiences of students and sounds like, what do our LGBTQ students have to say about how they are experiencing school and us? Discourse 1 deals with systemic and social reproduction, otherwise known as hegemony, and sounds like, hey, look at the parents, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Discourse 2 deals with interruption and transformation, and sounds like, when a student gets an F, who failed what? Who failed whom? D1 deals with how adults talk about students learning. Sounds like one student should not stop other students from learning. D2 deals with how students talk about their learning experiences and sounds like only the black kids get kicked out of her class because we're loud. That's because we never get help and are bored, so we play around. There was a group that I think a number of groups were doing root cause analysis. D2 is asking us to go to that root cause analysis. So take a moment. I'm just going to give us a very quick interaction with this document. Turn your page over and you'll see some blanks. Try to find at least one through line that you have a heart connection to because of your own context. What's the D1 that you might hear in your context, you might say in your context? How could that turn into D2?
So this is,
The Wheaties just kicked in.
We're videotaping
Oh,
this session,
got
and
it.
so these great contributions, I don't know if other people in the room can hear them, but we would like to capture them. I'm so sorry. Would you mind saying that once again?
okay, lower it down. Political correctness. Okay, so what I was saying was we talk all the time about political correctness. We talk about all of our students can succeed. We believe in all of our students and everybody is on that bandwagon. However, when we looked at the dashboard, we see students that are across the board in red, and specifically our students with disabilities. So if that is the case, then why are the results the way they are?
Lovely. I really appreciate that reflection. So an example of turning that into discourse 2 would be, so we believe all of our students can learn, and the discourse 2 would be, even though we believe all of our students can learn, we continue to educate only some of our students. Why? And how many people, when you read that, how many people thought about our current reality and this really challenging topic for some reason in our country around all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter? And All Lives Matter has gotten as much traction as it's gotten specifically because it's discourse 1, and to some people it sounds like we're doing good work. And it's actually about reproducing the same results, which are horrific. Thank you. Did I see another hand? Back here, please. And you're going to wait for the mic. Great.
How do adults talk about student learning experiences when students should not stop other students from learning? That hit home just last week when I was dealing with a behavior issue in a classroom for summer school. I was able to talk to the child, and when the students weren't there, the teacher turned to me. She's like, well, what am I supposed to do? I have 28 others that I have to teach. And I bit my tongue, and I walked away because I was trying to get a job at that district. But I sat in her class, and she's been with these students for 3 weeks, and it's boy, girl, that boy.
Wow.
I've walked through her classroom 4 times for 5 minutes, and I know at least 5 kids in that classroom, names. So that says a lot, you know.
Yeah.
That's why they're not learning and connecting to you. But how do you say that without stabbing her?
Well, I love that question. How do you say that without stabbing her? That's going to be the second part of the presentation, the end part of the presentation. So I love that. But here's what I would offer, right? Here's an example. Again, we're thinking about discourse 2 puts a mirror up. It puts inquiry up, right? So one thing we might say in that moment is, what are you afraid that girl and that boy might say about that teacher that is you? And so we want to invite people into inquiry around the root issues.
And children do say that. Their way of reflecting to teachers that react to that. Because when I pulled one of the boys out of class just to talk for 5 minutes. Hey, what's going on, you know?
Yep.
And he said, she sucks. She's a horrible teacher. She
Yeah.
doesn't know what she's doing. That's their way of communicating. But this is to me, you know, as I'm walking with them and just trying to, you know, de-escalate a situation.
Absolutely.
And so, but they trusted me, and I'd met him 5 minutes prior to that. So,
Nice.
but he saw that I was like, hey, buddy, what's going, you know, let's walk, you and I. Let's go get some water.
That's great.
And, you know, so, but kids have that reaction towards us too when we have and they just don't want to say it in class because then they're the ones getting kicked out for
That's
being
right.
loud and
That's
whatnot. Discourse too.
That's right. Thank you so much. And time for one more. Who? You're pointing to someone. Yes. We won't be able to get to everybody, and I apologize, but I hope that whoever's got their hand up will take up conversation with peers and et cetera. And so,
Good morning.
good morning.
One that I looked at and we've dealt with this year, the systemic and social reproduction. And we've often said in parent conferences when we've had problems with kids, continuously the same child. And then we just say, okay, look at the parent. The apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. They both act the same way. So, and we've been in discussions at my school, because I'm secondary, that there is a need for, because we've had parent university, but I think what we're trying to develop is family university, FAMU.
Nice.
So that we bring not only the parent and the student, but we give them both so that they maybe come to understand what we as teachers deal with, that we have 100+ kids, so their child's behavior is one of many, and then how they can help us and align with us. So that's kind of where we're trying to take this to deal with
Nice.
this.
I really appreciate that you're not letting that become sort of the end point of your conversation about the child, which is critical. And again, as you're saying it, what comes up for me when I think about how we might turn this into discourse 2 for the person who says it is, well, let's explore what role our schools played in the parent that person became. And we start thinking about what's the generational experience of school. All right, well, thank you. And whoever's hand was up again, I really encourage you while you're walking to get water or at lunch or whatnot, take up the conversation. I'll be around if it's a question for me specifically. I'm going to go through the last 2 stages fairly quickly because I want to get back to some interactive work with you all. And so when we talk about meaning making, 3 areas of work we need to create space for in our schools, for our educators, for our schools. The first one is we need to create space where people do their own individual work, because no matter how much collaboration we do, we are all, especially when it comes to social justice and racial inequities, we are all on our own journeys as well as in a collective journey. And we have got to support each other, even as part of our profession, to do some of that individual work. We need to create space, as you're going to experience in a moment, for people to work in affinity. And the reason people need to create spaces to work in affinity is manyfold. One is we need places of healing, every one of us. The harm that is being perpetuated by racism and oppression in our schools hurts all of us. And we need to explore how it hurts all of us. Some of us need to explore that less than others. But we need to have places of healing. We also need places of mentorship. And we need places where we can have conversation that the other people don't need to hear. For my people, there's a lot of questions and work that has to happen that I know our colleagues of color do not need to be in the room to hear. My colleagues of color frequently said, we get together and it's a healing place because we finally get to talk about the experiences that we're not allowed to talk about in some of our spaces. And we get to talk about how to change those realities. And so ultimately, we're doing that work. So in the third space, we are intentionally coming together across difference. We're not just mixing it up because it looks pretty. We have to figure out when we're coming together across difference intentionally to share and make new meaning of our dilemmas and our inequities. I'm going to just tell you about this, and I'm going to skip it, but you'll have access again to all of this. But this is an example of a piece of text that has some student words to it. And the idea here is that this is an example of how we can come across difference even with those who might not be in the room. And so we can bring in texts. And so in San Francisco Unified, one of the populations being pushed out at a great pace is our Black students. They're being pushed out of our classes, our schools, our district. And so students got together and did a focus group, and as a result, a text was created with their words and then shared with the whole district so that they could actually make meaning of the hearing from their students across difference. Okay. And then when we move to the last stage about radical change and bold action, Malcolm X says we can't teach what we don't know, we can't lead where we won't go, and this is sort of bringing together the work again, that we have to start with our own work, but it's so that we don't get caught up in our own agendas, but so that we're going back and changing our practice with and for our students, with and for each other. And we should do this, again, through regular, informed, formal, data-based inquiry, recognize, and we have to honor informed risk, progress, and change. And what this means is we have to recognize and honor informed failure. Right now in our system, it is safer to keep doing what is assured to get failure that we've always been doing than to take risks to do better and to fail at that. That's got to change. We need to reconceptualize evaluation and support, and we need to engage the wider community, because here's the only thing that folks may or may not be prepared for. When our schools become effective at closing the racial equity debt, the community will fight it. Because as much as our espoused goal is equity, there are so many, even social justice warriors, who benefit, and more importantly, whose children benefit from things not changing, that consciously and unconsciously, we will fight success. And we have to have a leg of our work being prepared for that. So radical discourse is needed. It's important to know that a rebel needs to say something and an activist needs something to be heard. So we have to figure out how to engage in radical discourse so that it can best be heard. And it's important to know that sometimes we got to just say, as a principal, everything was not up to the teachers. If I went into a classroom and I saw harm being done, even for a teacher who wanted to do well, I couldn't say, well, let's wait till you learn this. Sometimes the conversation was, tomorrow I need to see this, and for the next 6 weeks we'll figure out why. But tomorrow it needs to change. That's a suggestion, that's a direction. And we need to know, when is it that we are interrupting an inequity and saying, okay, this has got to stop because harm is happening, and when are we, and how are we engaging people through questions? And ultimately, discourse 2, probing questions, where folks really get to wrestle. So it's important that we know the difference of questions. So there's essential questions that we use to guide units of learning. There's framing questions that we ask people directly to help us with something. There's clarifying questions that I need an answer to so I can understand you better. And then there's probing questions. And probing questions are like gifts. Now, this is not a negative assumption when I say no lying is allowed in this next question. But no lying is allowed in this next question, all right? When you get a present, a wrapped present from somebody, I want to ask how many people want to open it right then before they even know what it's for and just want to rip it open and see what's in it. And then I'm going to ask how many people want to take it home and unwrap it in private and not in front of everyone, all right? How many people want to wrap it right away and they're like, oh, what's this for? Thank you. Nice. How many people are like, no, I got to take this home. Thank you so much. I'll let you know. Excellent. Nice. I've been in rooms this big where everybody has raised their hand for what they thought was the right answer. It's like, oh, no, I'm going to wait till later. I'm like, y'all lying. So a probing question is that type of gift, and a probing question is a gift, meaning that I don't need to see you open it. I'm asking you a question so you can own something and reflect on it for as long as, or in the fashion that you want, so you can own the inquiry. A Discourse 2 probing question is a probing question that is either steeped in or inviting of that Discourse 2, the naming the unnamed. My favorite definition of Discourse 2 is that it names shit. And that's real. Not a lot of pronouns, not a lot of vagueness to hide behind. So, let's play a game. It's the D2PQ game, or Discourse 2 probing question game. I'm actually, for the sake of time, just going to do this by hands, all right? I'm going to give you a topic, I'm going to give you a question, and we're going to do a quick show of hands. How many people think it's not even a probing question? How many people think it's a probing question? And how many think it's a Discourse 2 probing question? And then after we take a poll, we're going to look at examples of questions that might fit in that category. And I want to be clear, this is not an exact science. You could ask a clarifying question, and it could be received as a probing question. So it's not an exact science. When I was a closeted queer man in Rhode Island, I'm telling you, my relatives were just asking a clarifying question when they said, "Are you married yet?" That was a probe for me. So, we're going to just try our best. First topic, allies. Question, are you an ally? Show of hands, how many people think this is not a probing question? Okay, raise them high so everyone can see them. All right, how many people think this is a probing question? All right, majority. How many people think it's a D2PQ? Okay, maybe a handful. So, this is not a probing question, and I'm going to say why. It's closed. It's yes or no. So let's make believe I'm not an ally. That should probe me, right? But you've just given me a way out. No, I'm not. Thank you. Next question. A probing question might be, how have others been allies for you? A D2PQ might be, in the skin you are in, how have you been an ally for your immigrant students in today's political landscape? Do you see how it's naming some stuff? Do you see how it's putting your skin in the game? And so when we're faced with that teacher who's saying that student, and we're like, I don't know how to interrupt this, what might be a D2PQ we could ask that person? Collaboration. Example, what about your patterns of collaboration inhibit others from collaborating, and who? How many people think this is not a probing question? No one. It's not. It's not that, I'm saying you're right. That's what I mean, sorry. That's why I can't be a game show host. How many people think this is a probing question? Okay, a good number of people. And how many people think a D2PQ? All right. So this is something we would offer as a D2PQ. Not a probing question would be, when do you collaborate in school? Wednesdays. A probing question, what allows you to enjoy collaboration? This is good, you can get some good stuff out of it. But the third one is naming. It's putting your skin in the game. Grades. How do your grades indicate success? How many people think this is not a probing question? Still good. How many people think this is a probing question? How many people have their hands up because they're just doing this from elimination? How many people think this is a D2? Thank you for your honesty. How many people think this is a D2PQ? Okay, a few. So, what's the most common grade you give? Not a probing question. There's an answer. How do your grades indicate success? This is a good probe. That's a really good probing question, right? Who do your grades favor, and who do your grades not favor? The invitation to be at a deeper level of inquiry. Last one, bonus round. Race. Are all, oh, and to the person who did elimination, this is the fourth one. Are all white people racist? How many people think this is not a probing question? Nice. How many people think it is a probing question? How many people think it's a D2PQ? Okay. Remember I said something could be a clarifying question, but it could be felt as a probe? That would be this one, because again, I can be like, yeah, they are. No, they're not. Done. It's also the wrong question that we're asking about race right now. So a probing question might be, how do all white people benefit from institutionalized racism in the United States? And if we really want to put the heat up, how have you, regardless of the skin you're in, participated in perpetuating the white supremacist culture institutionalized in our schools? So your skin is in the game, we're naming some stuff, but we're moving away from, again, the reductionist way we've been talking about race. And in our country, we are still struggling with talking about race because we think when we talk about race, we're automatically calling everybody who's white a racist. We think when we talk about who benefits and who's disadvantaged by racism, we think we're talking about the actions of the individual in a conscious way. Now, I want to be clear, because I'm saying that's not an equivalent, that doesn't mean I do or don't think that every white person is racist. I'm simply saying it's a different conversation. And I'll have people who want to debate with me on who's racist and who's not, and that's fine. That's a fine debate, but it's keeping us from acknowledging that there is a white supremacist construct in our country that we are all affected by. And we have to get past the fear of how we play into that, keeping us from talking about that. If we want to talk about who we are and if we're racist and we're not, have that conversation. But it is a different conversation than whether or not we're living in a country that is built on racist premises. All right. We're going to do one table scenario, and then I'm going to close by reading a story to you. Which table scenario should I use? Yeah, let's use this one because I think it relates to a little bit the scenario that someone wrote out. So at your tables, you're just going to practice. If you were faced with this scenario, what's an example of a D2PQ you might ask in this moment that might help change the direction of the conversation from being discourse 1 to discourse 2? And let me be very clear. This is a skill that is built over many, many iterations of practice and time. Some of the schools we work with practice scenarios to practice their D2PQs every single week. We worked with principals in San Francisco, and they asked us to spend 1 out of every 4 hours we spent with them just practicing these. So this is not a final test. This is practice. So during a professional development meeting, one teacher responds to the sharing of data, identifying the students your school is not serving, and saying, these poor kids are worried about where they're getting their next meal. Isn't it good enough that they're coming to school where they have a warm roof over their heads? So if that were to be said, how might you offer a D2PQ to reroute that conversation? Just have a little bit of table conversation for about 2 to 3 minutes, get at least 1 or 2 ideas out there.
Well, just hello, good morning, everyone. I'm a firm believer in starting any answer to a question with, I'm no expert, but, and then ending it with, I'm just asking questions. I feel like I can say anything between those 2 frames. So what our group came up with was, how do our beliefs about student socioeconomic realities inform our inform our expectations of student learning?
Nice, nice. How do our beliefs about a student's socioeconomic status inform our expectations about their learning? It's beautiful. Nice.
Thank you.
I think that's a great D2PQ. I also think, depending on your relationship, you could also make it personal to the person who spoke and say, help me understand, how do your beliefs, and so you could also make it your, because that person put that out there. And, please.
So, what's your stance on
I'll repeat it, yeah. The question is, what's my stance on the inclusive language of our versus your? I think the inclusive language is a scaffold to the discourse 2 you want to get to, because the idea isn't just to keep an inquiry out there. The idea is for us to do our own work. And if I'm putting that Discourse 1 out there as a belief of mine, I want to be in a community that's going to interrupt me and allow me to check that. If by you asking that question directly of me, I'm going to run, then we haven't created the conditions yet. So the idea is that we're constantly creating community and conditions so that you can be as direct as possible, and I will follow up by saying, thank you for asking that question. Let's talk about it. Great. Thank you. So here's how I want to close. I'm taking a risk here. I'm doing something a little bit different. I never read long pieces during keynotes, and I'm going to read a long piece because it's a story of a student that I've come to know, and it's a story that of a student that I think has a lot to teach us. And so it's 2 pages, so if you need to shift your butt a little to be more comfortable, I'm going to encourage you to do that. I'm going to also ask you to listen and listen. The student is D. I'm calling the student D, and I'm going to ask you to listen. Who are your Ds? Who are your Ds? How are you connected to this story? Dee was born 8 years ago to another child of only 14 years who herself was in a group home within the state foster care system. For the first year of his life, Dee's birth mother received parenting support, but it was not enough. For a year, she refused to touch him or feed him or bond with him until she abandoned him in a park, after which he was removed from her care. He was placed in a foster home with a strong black woman who agreed to love him and take care of him, but not as her own. She knew she would be a temporary placement, so she treated him differently than that of her own 3 daughters. In this home, Dee never saw a picture of himself alongside those of his foster sisters. He was never given the same privileges as his siblings, including free access to the kitchen or certain toys. Still, he came to see this woman who in the end cared for him each day as his real mother. His temporary time with her extended to nearly 5 years before a family asked if they could be his permanent family. Even then, the first option was given to his foster mother, who again said she could not be his permanent parent. So Dee's foster workers decided to move Dee to his permanent home 2 days after they met, with no notice to Dee. He thought he was going for a sleepover. 2 more days, and Dee was introduced to his new school, where he would finish kindergarten. The school claimed to specialize in educating black boys who experienced trauma. Upon entering the building for the first time, Dee and his family were approached and asked for a copy of his IEP. Dee had no IEP. School had been a place of stability, and Dee excelled there. Things at home were naturally challenging, but Dee exceeded expectations for a 5-year-old in this situation. He was scared but courageous, cautious but open. Most of all, he was incredibly communicative about what he was experiencing in ways that were beyond his time on this earth. 1 week into school, Dee's family asked for an SST to develop a plan of support through his transition. After obligatory and somewhat shallow statements about Dee's strengths, in other words, his likes, Dee's teacher expressed concern about Dee's quote-unquote aggression. His family interrogated the word and learned that Dee's quote-unquote aggression actually fell into 3 areas: play, for which other students acting the same way were not being called aggressive; responses to adults putting their hands on Dee; and moments of dysregulation when Dee was asking or seeking assurance that his life was going to be okay, times when such assurances were not given. Within a few weeks, Dee had stopped talking about math and reading and Spanish and only talked about his experiences related to behaviors and conflicts at school. Dee's family wanted to work with the school, but felt that the stakes were too high with the current set of conditions, so they left. Dee's family enrolled him in a private school, one that claimed to specialize serving students who had experienced trauma in their formative years. Classes were no larger than 15. The campus sat in a beautiful wooded setting. Dee loved his teacher. He started talking about academics again and could not wait to go to school each morning. In the afternoons, however, he struggled. In the afternoons, the school used community partners who had less experience with trauma. In the afternoons, Dee's family started to get phone calls, first sporadically, then weekly, then daily. Each and every time, the school said the same thing. It was our fault. We triggered Dee. The family actually found solace in this humility. One of Dee's parents temporarily moved his home office to the school to be available for support in the afternoon and to observe. Within a week, an afternoon teacher approached Dee's parent and said, "Your child just threatened me." After checking in with Dee, the parent learned that Dee had picked up an empty spray can that was left on the ground and held it up to the adult after she had pulled him by the arm. The parent asked the white female teacher a number of questions, including why she was afraid of this tiny, playful, scared, newly 6-year-old black boy. The teacher, crying, left campus and insisted on a restorative conference with the parent. After the restorative conference, the parents found Dee's third school in 4 academic months. At this new school, Dee was placed in the first grade with a strong black elder teacher. Dee's parents informed her of the recent transitions and offered a number of supports for her and Dee. She refused, saying, "When he's in this class, he is mine. I don't need anyone else but you. We got this." That first week, no phone calls were made home. Dee shared that he loved his new teacher, and when asked why, he said, "Because she has my back." For the remainder of the year, there was constant communication with the school regarding events and zero calls regarding behavioral concerns for the whole year. In the second grade class, his teacher, a younger white woman, started the relationship, admitting to Dee's parents that she had very little experience working with black kids. This, while a disappointing fact, was reassuring as she demonstrated humility in this admission and in her request to work more closely to support Dee. They did work closely for months, including multiple home visits just for relationship building. The two parents spent a lot of time in the classroom. Even with the positive relationship building, they observed a pattern of Dee, as well as other black boys, being treated with a separate set of rules. The teacher was always open to discussing and addressing these observations, but unfortunately, by December, not only did the patterns persist, but also Dee had begun a level of negative self-talk that was new. He reflected on and questioned what was wrong with him. He frequently asked why teachers listened to and treated the white students differently than him. And also, for the first time, Dee was behind in every grade level assessment. This time it was with the school itself that Dee's family made a change mid-year. They decided to put Dee back in the first grade teacher's classroom, even though he would remain in the second grade. The reported incidents and the phone calls home ended immediately. Ended. By the end of that year, Dee met or exceeded 95% of his grade level standards. Some closing comments about Dee. This is not to make us feel bad for Dee. He's teaching us something here. With one exception for being sick, Dee never missed a single day of school in any of the 3 schools. Throughout his entire tenure for this timeline, Dee has never stopped talking about his future plans, which span no less than 6 admirable helping careers, from police to firefighter to vet to medical doctor, always making the connection that he will need to go to college. He plans on going to Stanford. Most importantly, throughout this entire narrative, Dee started and still starts every single day new. Regardless what he experiences the day before, he wakes up every morning forgiving yesterday. He wakes up every morning with joy and dance and hunger and questions and charge. He wakes up every morning with hope, with the belief and expectation that today will be a great day. The work of transformation is ridiculously hard. When I think about Dee, I have a hard time thinking about how quickly we give up. When the ones who are facing the impact of our giving up are not giving up. So I'm going to ask you to think about who your Dee is, and I'm going to ask you to hold her or him in every single day that you find yourself challenged. Thank you very much. Thank you. So Vernon is joining me up here because we want to set you off to your break and then to your affinity groups. And so I wanted to just share a word or two about affinity groups, and then we're each going to say a word or two about the different spaces. And so when we talk about affinity groups, first of all, affinity groups have a long history in our country as places of healing, places of radical action. But when we're talking about affinity groups within our schools, organized spaces, we have found that there's some practices that are really helpful to engage in. And so just keep in mind that an affinity group is a group of people that share something in common, an interest, a background, a goal, and that they're coming together for a specific purpose that should be clear, and that these are also people that may be linked by a common bond, such as an organization, a group, et cetera. And when we talk about coming together and doing the transformative work in affinity groups, one of the things that we feel like when it's in an organized space is critical is that we are separating to do some healing work, some mentorship, and some collaboration, so that, again, in that stage of meaning making, we intentionally come back across difference right afterwards to do some work together based on that work we did in affinity. And that's what we're hoping is going to happen today. And so the general agenda, which your table facilitators or room facilitators will have, is that there'll be a warm-up, and the warm-up will be to quickly check in about how does it feel to be in this group, because moving to affinity for people who don't usually do it comes with some feelings. You'll have an opportunity to go back to the 3-2-1 bridge that Marlene had introduced. Then we're going to ask for a charted discussion, and you see charted in quotations. It's really critical to know that you're not transcribing the discussion. You're having a discussion that's going to be guided by the facilitators, and you're discussing what is it in that discussion that you might be willing to share out. The other pieces are purely confidential and stay in that space. And so you want to make sure you take time to determine who's going to share out, what you're going to share out, and how you're going to decide what is shared out, okay? So Vernon and I are going to speak a little bit about the two spaces.
Well, first, excuse me, my voice is leaving me as well. First of all, I really do think before I speak to this, I think you guys need to give Greg another hand. You know, an affinity group is really designed to provide you with a safe space, a place where you can feel comfortable and have pride, a place where you can learn a little bit about yourself and use the learning about yourself to transfer to someone else, like your students. And what I'm going to do is something that's going to be really out of my comfort zone. I'm going to share a real brief conversation I had with my son, who lives in Burbank, California. Jesus, he's in Tinseltown. He's in the place where he's a model. So he's dealing with all the stuff. And something he said to me last night is very similar to what Greg has already talked about. He said something about a wound. He said once the wound is open, he said you think the wound is healing, and then it's open again, and then it's open again. And I equate what he was saying to me last night with what Greg said about the paper cut. And he said, you just don't understand. And as a parent, you know, and he's 38 years old, so I'm acting like he's still 5, right? As a parent, I said, you know how you were raised. You're a pretty strong person. And he says, you always say that. I said, well, it's true. I said, but you have to think about where you are and how you have chose to be part of this process. He said, I didn't choose to be part of this process. He had me something to think about. He said, this process is everywhere, because he's traveled a lot. So the affinity group is something I sort of mentioned to him last night. It's important to have a safe place. His safe place for him, and it's not necessarily dealing with a lot of people, is to go to the beach at night and just relax. That's his safe place. Or to meditate and reflect on what's been happening to him. So all of you around here are going to have a safe place to go. Even here. Take advantage of it.
Thank you. So right now, I just want to speak to my fellow white people in the room who will be in white affinity groups. I really appreciate what Vernon is saying, and he's speaking to how we're creating space for the same work, but we have different work to do. And it makes sense that some affinity groups would look to the affinity group as a place to be a safe space for healing first. And for white people that are in that benefit from dominant culture, where we usually exist without the knowledge of whether or not we're in, without having to worry about whether or not we're in danger all the time, I would push us to be in that space, to have a brave space. That as folks from dominant culture, we frequently, in my experience, will frequent. How is that? Is that good? In my experience, I'm no expert, but we frequently approach affinity groups from a place of discomfort and why do we have to separate and why do we have to be alone, et cetera. And there's a lot of reasons underneath that, but I just want to surface something. I find it ironic that we resist being in affinity to do race work when in our day-to-day living, we can frequently be in affinity. And so I encourage us to take the opportunity, as Vernon is doing, and to treat this as a brave space.
All righty. Marlene just reminded me to tell everybody where the rooms are. Can you hear me? Nobody can ever hear me anyway because I talk very low. See if she gave me the right thing here. All right. Well, I think the white affinity group goes to Salon 1, 2, and 3. Is that correct? And then the people of color goes to Salon 4. Did I miss anything?
And there'll be further identification within that, but we also have, okay, but we also, will that be the same room that people who identify as mixed race with white go? What's that? Okay, great, excellent, okay, good.
What I'd like to also say that you have we're going to have an unfortunately, abbreviated break around 10 minutes instead of 15. I hope we can handle that.